Come join me on my second channel, Jaguar Gator 8, where we'll talk all things college football. New video drops every Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch the latest video. And now, on with our feature presentation. A few months ago, I made a video about this Week 13 game in 2000 between the San Diego Chargers and the Kansas City Chiefs. It featured a winless team on what felt like the world's longest losing streak, going up at home against a 5-win team who absolutely needed to win this game to stay in the playoff picture. The good news was that the winless team won, and they finally got a win to their name, with the Chargers pulling off the upset and sending the home fans home happy. The bad news was that there was a giant controversy involving CBS and who could watch this game, because an update on the results of the 2000 presidential election was given in the final 2 minutes, meaning that no one could watch the ending. If you want to learn more about that incident, click the card in the upper right corner. And I bring this game and this incident up because, amazingly enough, this was not the first time in NFL history that a winless team hosted a 5-win team, the winless team pulled off the upset at home, the game was being aired on CBS, and there was a giant controversy involving the broadcasting of this game. You wouldn't think that this would be a deja vu situation of sorts, but yet, in 1983, that's exactly what happened when the Houston Oilers played the Detroit Lions, and one CBS station decided not to air the game, even though everyone thought they would, resulting in a giant broadcasting feud. And this is the story behind the broadcasting controversy involving the Houston Oilers and CBS. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, we need some context to understand this game and what was happening with the Oilers and CBS at the time. It's November 13th, 1983, and we have an interconference game on our hands at the Houston Astrodome between the Houston Oilers and the Detroit Lions. For the Lions, this is an absolutely monumental game. With 6 games left in the season, they sit at 5-5, 1 game back in the Minnesota Vikings for first place in the NFC Central. And it is an absolute dogfight for the wild card in the NFC, as you had 8 teams in the conference at or above 500 fighting for 5 spots. Basically, there wasn't a whole lot of room for error if the Lions wanted to make the playoffs for the second straight season. That was the bad news. The good news was that they had what seemed like a cakewalk of an opponent with the Houston Oilers, because they were, without a doubt, the worst team in football. This was an Oilers team that, dating back to 1982, had lost 17 straight games. The last time they won a game was before the strike. You have to go back to September of 1982 to find the last time that the Oilers walked away from a game victorious. If you want to learn more about this losing streak of theirs, click the card in the upper right corner. And in 1983, they were picking up right where they left off from 1982, continuing to stink up the joint. They were the only winless team in the league. They scored just 166 points, which was the worst total in the AFC and the second worst total in the NFL, only ahead of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at 158. They allowed 301 points, for over 30 points per game, which was the worst total in the AFC and the second worst total in the NFL, only ahead of the St. Louis Cardinals. Their point differential, which was an abysmal minus 135, was the worst in the NFL by a comfortable margin, and was 81 points worse than the next worst team in the AFC, which was the San Diego Chargers at minus 54. That's how bad they were. And to put the cherry on top, in their most recent game, they lost 55-14 at home to the Cincinnati Bengals, in a game so bad that the Oilers committed 12 penalties for 131 yards and turned it over a whopping 7 times. A win here by the Oilers would not only give interim head coach Chuck Studley his first win, but would put a merciful end to one of the longest losing streaks in NFL history. As for who would be watching this contest, besides Lions fans in Detroit, you'd think that the state of Texas would be tuned in, especially since CBS had a doubleheader that week, and the Dallas Cowboys were playing on the network at 4 o'clock. Seems like an easy choice. Put the Oilers on at 1 o'clock, and the Cowboys on at 4 o'clock. However, this doesn't take into account one tiny factor, and that is just how much the Oilers sucked. By this point in 1983, no one wanted to watch the Oilers, and a ton of TV stations in Texas requested and were given permission to show other games. If you weren't surrounding Houston, You just get the best game of the week, and wouldn't be subjected to watching the Oilers find new and exciting ways to shoot themselves in the foot. That is, every city except for Austin. Austin had a large contingency of Oilers fans in the area, and it made sense why. Austin is over 40 miles closer to Houston than Dallas, so for all intents and purposes, even if it might not be this way in actuality, the Oilers were the hometown team. Just to prove this, here's the TV guide from Austin on January 2nd, 1983, which was the last Sunday of the strike-shortened 1982 season. Austin's getting the game between the Houston Oilers and the Cincinnati Bengals. Keep in mind that there were other significantly more important games that day, including the win-and-you're-in battle between the Buffalo Bills and the New England Patriots, and the battle between the Cleveland Browns and the Pittsburgh Steelers, where the Browns would be in with the win. The Oilers were 1-7. Austin got that game, despite it meaning absolutely nothing. You get the idea. Austin was synonymous with the Oilers, and was the only city clinging onto every minute of every game, even if the rest of the state had given up. But finally, on November 13th, 1983, after 17 straight losses, the Houston Oilers achieved something that many thought was impossible. They doubted whether man could walk on the moon. They doubted whether a flying machine could actually work. And they doubted whether the Oilers could actually win a game. And just like Armstrong and the Wright brothers, Chuck Studley proved America wrong. Because for the first time in 14 months, the Oilers walked away from the game victorious. The Oilers prevailed 27-17 and dominated in the second half, scoring the final 17 points of the game while forcing Lions quarterback Eric Hipple to throw 3 interceptions over the final 30 minutes. Earl Campbell, even if it took a while to get going, did Earl Campbell things yet again, running for 107 yards. As a side note, to learn more about the great career of one of the greatest running backs of all time, click the card in the upper right corner. Quarterback Oliver Luck, who won his first game ever with this performance, had the best game of his career, throwing 2 touchdown passes, completing a very nice 69% of his passes, and posting a passer rating of 99.7. Not only was this the highest passer rating of his career in a start, and not only was this the highest completion percentage of his career in a start, but this was the first and only time in his career that he ever threw multiple touchdowns in a game. After losing the turnover battle with a margin of -6 in the previous week against the Bengals, they won it by 3 in this game. After committing 12 penalties the previous week against the Bengals, they only committed 2 this week. And there was not a single passing play that the Oilers called that went for negative yardage. In other words, this was a fantastic performance and a surprisingly clean game. So you'd imagine that Austin would be going crazy over the win, right? At long last, their team's historically bad losing streak was over. No more would they be subject to reading the papers, seeing the standings, and seeing a goose egg next to their team in the win column. And yes, the Oilers fans in Austin were going crazy, but it wasn't for the reason that you might assume. Because they weren't going crazy about the win. Instead, they were going crazy because for some inexplicable reason, the CBS affiliate in Austin, KTBC, decided not to show the game. What you're watching right now is the battle in the NFC Central that took place at the same time between the 6-4 Minnesota Vikings and the 5-5 Green Bay Packers. It was a big game, and it was a great contest. After the Packers jumped out to a 19-0 lead in the first half, the Vikings were able to cut it all the way to a 1-point game in the fourth quarter, before a 19-yard touchdown pass by Lynn Dickey to Hall of Famer James Lofton iced the game, sealed the deal, and gave the Packers a tie for first place in the division with a 29-21 win. As a side note, to learn more about James Lofton and something else that happened to him during that 1983 season, click the card in the upper right corner. And I bring this game up because in Austin, if you flipped on CBS for the early games, that was the game that you were watching. For the first time all season, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Austin was being shut out of watching their Oilers play. And of all the weeks for it to happen too. And it would be one thing if this was announced a week in advance. But here's where things get kinda crazy and go off the rails. The decision to show the Packers-Vikings game in Austin was made 2 weeks before. So with this game taking place on November 13th, the decision to air the NFC Central matchup over the winless Oilers was made sometime right around Halloween. For 2 whole weeks, KTBC, the CBS affiliate for Austin, knew about this. And for 2 whole weeks, the decision went unreported, with everyone being kept in the dark. This is the TV guide for Austin for the day of the game. Notice how in the early slot for KTBC, the CBS station is listing the game between the Detroit Lions and the Houston Oilers. Literally no one knew about this. And then at the very last minute, even though it was a decision made well in advance, viewers in Austin were shocked when they were not getting the Oilers. At least if they knew in advance, even if they didn't agree with it, they could find ways to get around it, like going to a bar, finding a motel, or even driving down to Houston to attend the game. But with this, they were straight out of luck, and the faithful Oilers fans of Austin made their feelings known by the masses. In total, KTBC received 300 angry telephone calls regarding their decision not to air the Oilers game, even though Austin got every Oilers game before this, and even though the morning paper said that this game was going to be aired. So with that, it was time for KTBC to face the music. A spokesperson was asked, quite bluntly, what their rationale was for dropping the Oilers. Why did you decide not to air the Oilers game that Sunday? Want to know what that spokesperson wound up saying? Turns out, they didn't have a reason. They were unable to explain their rationale. They were unavailable to tell the public why they made this move. I'm sorry, what? You didn't have a reason for dropping the Oilers? First off, I find it highly concerning that this is the NFL we're talking about here. There's millions upon millions of dollars on the line each week with advertisements and ratings and the whole 9 yards. And in Austin, which has one of the top 40 markets in the country from a TV perspective, the people in charge of picking the games for one of the 2 networks airing games on Sundays had no idea why they made the switch. The fact that you're a spokesperson and you cannot speak to the people is not a good trait at all. But number 2, and perhaps most importantly, how do you not have a reason? All you had to do was literally make something up. There was a reason sitting right in front of you. The Packers-Vikings game was to determine first place in the NFC Central. The Oilers were mathematically eliminated from playoff contention, and more than half of their losses were by double digits, so they weren't competitive at all. And we wanted to have a competitive, meaningful game to serve as a strong lead into the Cowboys game in the later window. Was that so hard? You could have easily pulled the "we decide to show the better game" card, and you would have gotten off the hook quite easily. But to offer up nothing? To have no reasoning whatsoever? Come on. That's just incompetence of the highest order, which seems like a pretty common theme for a lot of these affiliates from the 1980s. And because of this inexplicable decision by KTBC, as well as the awful communication on their end both before and after the game, the entire state of Texas did not get to watch the Oilers play. The game was blacked out in Houston, as the game was nowhere close to a sellout. Most of the state abandoned the Oilers weeks ago in favor of showing off better games. Austin was just about the last holdout, and the great irony was that they held out in hopes that they could see a win. And the one time they win a game, they don't even show it. For what it's worth, the NBC affiliate in Austin, KTVV, which usually televises the Oilers as part of the AFC package, said that they were sticking with the Oilers the rest of the way, and that they would never do what the CBS affiliate did. So chalk up some free PR points for that station. So what's the moral of the story here? It's probably not a good idea to not show the team with the strongest local fan base. But if you're going to make that decision to not show that game, at the very least, don't do what KTBC did. Don't sit on it for 2 weeks and announce it as a surprise 2 minutes before kickoff. And if you're going to do it, at the very least, when people ask what happened and why it happened, don't give literally nothing as an answer, especially when it would have taken all of 2 seconds to pull literally anything out of thin air. Something is better than nothing. Because on this November day in 1983, when the Oilers broke their infamous streak, their biggest and most loyal fans were unable to see it because of some absolute incompetence, poor communication, and let's be honest, poor everything on the part of KTBC. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com And be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9. To see college football videos, subscribe to JaguarGator8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.